So it's with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce one of Australia's leading researchers in the fields of women, work and family, Professor Marian Baird. She is the chair of the Discipline of Work and Organisational Studies in the University of Sydney's Business School and the Professor of Gender and Employment Relations. In addition to being recognised in the Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence, she's received a number of federal and state government grants to research various topics in the fields of women, work and family. Professor Baird has been commissioned by business, non-for-profits, unions and other organisations to undertake workplace and policy-related research in regards to women and workforce engagement. She's widely published in Australia and internationally. Please help me welcome Professor Marian Baird.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for that long introduction. May I also thank Mary Crawford, where's Mary gone, for inviting me up, and particularly Q Super for sponsoring the conference and my visit. It's a real pleasure to be back in Brisbane. I did live here for a short while in the early 80s. I came up and worked for the Queensland Teachers Union for a short period of time, which I was saying to Jim as we flew in this morning, it was probably one of the most memorable times in my life because it was before I had children and I didn't have any family to support or worry about in Brisbane, so I had a really free rein and really enjoyed my time here and made some great friends. So I always return with enthusiasm, so thanks very much. I'm actually just back from an ASEAN meeting in Manila, the Philippines. And at that meeting, gender, equality and empowerment were the focus of attention. I have to say that wherever you go at the moment, there's a huge interest in women and in getting women back into the workforce. So in terms of my research area, I suppose I've been fairly fortunate to be interested in this topic for some time. I've been researching women in work for close to 20 years now. And I've sort of lived and breathed the changes in the Australian labour market. And I want to really pick up on a couple of issues in today's presentation. I want to make an argument that we're not actually just arguing for equality, because that can run the risk of arguing for equality at a lower standard. We really need to make an argument for equality and quality, a quality society and equality for all. And I'll go through why I think that's really necessary in my presentation. I also want to sort of outline what I think would be the framework that we would need. What sort of policy framework do we need to reach this, what I hope would be a realistic state, but at the moment feels a bit idealistic. So I've called my speech the equality plus quality equation. And I mentioned that one of the things that all governments or people are really talking about at ASEAN and other places is getting more women back into the workforce. And the argument is put by almost every international think tank, every government around the world, that if we increase female workforce participation, the economic wisdom, if that's not an oxymoron, following my previous speakers, is that women's increased participation will increase GDP dramatically, and yes, it will, but will it increase the societies or improve the quality of life that we're living? The World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, and I have to read this out, says in 2016, is one of the most recent reports advocating increasing women's participation in the labour market. And they say that ensuring the healthy development and appropriate use of half of the world's talent pool, and I love that language, talent pool actually means people, and half of the world's talent pool is women. If we use half of the world's talent pool or increase its use, it will have a vast bearing on the growth, competitiveness and future readiness of economies and business worldwide. So I do agree with both Jim and John and Sally this morning about a turn in the sort of neoliberal argument. But I'm not convinced it's turned completely, because what we're now seeing is every argument about social good being couched in an economics or business case framing. And I think we have to be very careful then about how we use this language. I am greatly in favour of moving away from the neoliberal agenda, but I'm not convinced we've lost it completely. That Global Economic Forum go on to say, a variety of models and empirical studies have suggested that improving gender parity or equality may result in significant economic dividends. Notable recent estimates, and we hear these sorts of estimates all the time, suggest that economic gender parity could add an additional $240 billion to the GDP of the United Kingdom, $1,201 billion to that of the United States, $526 billion to Japan's GDP, $285 billion to the GDP of Germany. So we get these economic calculations constantly. In Australia, we've been told just last month by our Employment Minister, Michaelia Cash, that supporting women to participate in the workforce is an economic and social priority of the Turnbull government. It's good for business, it's good for women, and it's good for families, and it's good for our economy. So that is the rhetoric we're getting all the time. She goes on to say, boosting women's workforce participation is essential to raising living standards and securing Australia's future prosperity. It has the potential to add up to $25 billion to the Australian economy per year. So that's the economic argument. But I suppose we should be slightly pleased to hear that the World Economic Forum also put forward a more of a social case. They say there's a clear values-based case for promoting gender parity. Women are one half of the world's population, they've reminded us again, and evidently deserve equal access to health. I love the way they pop that word in. Evidently, they deserve equal access to health, education, economic participation and earning potential, and political decision-making. However, it's pertinent to note that gender parity is equally fundamental to whether and how societies thrive. Ensuring the healthy development and appropriate use of half of the world's talent pool, again, has a vast bearing on the growth, competitiveness and future readiness of economies and businesses worldwide. So there you go. Everybody agrees, it seems, that men and women should be treated equally. It's good for the economy and good for society. The trouble is the reality doesn't match the rhetoric. Not in ASEAN, not in Europe, not in Australia, maybe in Scandinavia, and even there it's changed quite dramatically. So I just want to put up a list of some of the gaps in Australia at the moment, and I really don't expect you to go through those line by line. What's interesting to note when you compile these sorts of figures is that there is one area that women outperform, or where the gap is in favour of women, and that's in education. And that's been the case for probably the last 20 years. We've seen a huge swing to increasing the investment in education, in female education. Now, this is driven by females' personal desire to increase their qualifications, but also access to education and changing social norms and attitudes. The problem is, of course, that it hasn't paid off in the workforce, and I'll go on to consider that in more detail. So as I said at the beginning, I am interested in these inequalities, but I'm also interested in making a case for improving quality for all and not pursuing just an inequality agenda. Hence the equality plus quality equation that I'd like to promote. And that equation goes something like this, that if we improve our gender equality policies at the workplace level and have an enabling institutional environment, we will have, or that will result in, improved gender equality outcomes and a higher quality society for all. So let's have a look at some of these rankings and quality indicators that we have around the world at the moment. And this really struck me over in Manila because people love to talk about gender gaps and gender gap reports and where countries sit. And I'm always worried about those indexes anyway, but having this conference in mind made me really think about what lies behind those indices. So the one that's most often reported is the Global Gender Gap report. And on that report, Australia ranks 46th in the world. The top countries, the top 5 countries, perhaps you can guess, you'll guess the first 4 anyway, Iceland, Finland, Norway and Sweden, and then Rwanda is 5th. So there you go. That makes me think, okay, there's something going on in the way they do these calculations. Also ahead of Australia are the Philippines at 7, Nicaragua at 10 and South Africa at 15. So how do they do these rankings? Well, they use 4 different areas: economic participation and opportunity, where Australia ranks first. Economic participation and opportunity, where we rank 42nd. Educational attainment, where Australia ranks first in the world. Political empowerment, where Australia ranks 61st, and health and survival, where Australia ranks 72nd. So you can see our ranking is really sort of varied or dispersed. But I think when you look deeper into those rankings, you get the picture of what I'm trying to say here. The reason why countries like the Philippines, Rwanda, Nicaragua and South Africa rank higher is because both men are equally doing poorly on those ratings. But the ratings then make them look like they're doing well. And I think that is the issue we really need to consider. What do we want when we think about equality, and what do we want when we think about the sort of society we want to live in? We know that women are now and have been for some time outdoing men in terms of educational qualifications. As I've said, there's a 10 to 11% gap in favour of women. But does this translate to the workplace? No. And so that's where I want to go now, to the labour market and to 2 gaps that often get discussed. So the first one is the participation gap, the one that the government wants us to increase, and the second one is the pay gap, and then I want to talk about the implications for superannuation. I might come back to this because I'm worried I'm going to run out of time, but this is really my argument for building a society that has a framework that suits all: the workplace policies, the enabling institutional environment, women's empowerment, and a better outcome for all. So I'll leave about 5 pages and we can come back to that sort of section if we like. Because really where I want to go next then is other labour market statistics. So if we look at these statistics here, you can see that women have been pulling their weight over the last few years, 30 to 40 years, and increasing their participation in the Australian labour market. But the other thing we see is that men have actually been declining their participation rate. So that raises a concern. We have slightly declining by about 10% over that period, male participation, and constant, although perhaps levelling out now, female participation. So that's participation, and I know that some of my colleagues in the room will say shouldn't just look at participation, because participation includes everyone who's willing to work. So it includes those who are in work and those who are looking for work. So let's look at employment rates, that is, men and women who actually have jobs. And here we can see quite an interesting pattern as well. The gap between males and females is closing. And again, males' employment rates have been falling and females' employment rates have been increasing. So that, for me, in terms of equality, is not actually what we want to see. It's not such a good idea to improve equality between the genders by decreasing the standards of one, which is what you can do. And the current government's plan is to close the gap in participation rates by 25% by 2025. Well, you can do that in 2 ways. You can increase female participation, or male participation can decrease. So, you know, numbers are, well, you have to be careful how we use them, as we all know. Here's the labour force participation rate by age. And here you see another interesting pattern occurring. Men and women, when they're younger, both participate in reasonably high proportions. Females actually participate more than men in the 15 to 19-year-old age group. Then it starts to drop away a bit. And you can see that overall, except for that youngest age group, men's participation rates are slightly higher, and higher in some age groups considerably than women's. And the reason for that, of course, is because women are bearing the child bearing children and leaving the labour market. This is men's participation rates over their lifetime. It's that other graph drawn differently, but also comparing different years, the 70s to now. And it's a bit hard to see the differences, except that what you can see in that graph is that men's life cycle participation, the picture of it or the curve of it, hasn't changed dramatically in the last 30 to 40 years. Men enter the workforce, they stay in the workforce, and then they leave around 60 to 65. They did extend their workforce participation in the 80s as a response to the GFC and the need to build up their super funds. But this is women's participation rates, and this is where we do see the quite dramatic, or employment rates I'm measuring here really. We do see quite a difference between men and women. And the big shift that's happened here, well, there are two major shifts. Here you can see the differences more clearly. The blue line is women in the 1970s, and you can see women entered the labour market, came out of the labour market to have children, stayed out for a while, and then some went back, but not in the same proportions as before, and then left the labour market. So that's the classic M curve, and that dip, or that nappy valley, is the time when they're having children and caring for their babies. But if you look at the other line, the top line that sort of has a straighter line at the top there, maybe I've got a pointer here actually. Oh, it doesn't work. Okay, well, people can see that. I mean, that shows there's been a huge change in Australia, that Australian women with children enter the labour market and they stay attached to the labour market through their childbearing years. In some states, they actually increase their participation rates when they have children. In New South Wales, that's the case. And I think that's because, back to the housing issue, because of mortgage stress and education. So cost of education and houses increases their participation rates. That's one hypothesis anyway. The other big shift that we haven't talked about much in Australia yet is the other peak happening, and that's mature age women. Women 45 to 50 and above, they have actually increased their participation rates more than any other group in Australia in the last 20 years. So we have two enormous shifts in the characteristic of the Australian labour market, and that is female participation, females of childbearing age, and then women of a more mature age. And the government wants more of those women to return. But what are women doing in Australia? This is their response to our framework, and that is they work part-time. This is a graph of full-time employment by age groups, but you'll see for all age groups it hasn't shifted that much. And in fact, if we aggregated the lot, full-time employment for women has actually decreased slightly over that period of time. So in Australia, we have a 1.5 breadwinner or a 1+ breadwinner model, and Australian women, although they've increased their participation altogether, have actually decreased their hours of work. And I have to rush through. So what happens as a result of that? Well, we know that there's a pay gap. The pay gap most recently reported in Australia is 15.3%. That's a slight decline from last year, about 0.9%. So we've closed the pay gap. We've improved our inequality. But how have we done that? And that returns to our previous speakers' comments. We've closed the pay gap really because men's pay didn't grow as rapidly and because overall wage growth was low. So men's pay increased by 1.5% and women's pay by 2.6%. Now that's relatively a better outcome for women, but it's not a better outcome for the whole group, and it's not really the way we would want to close a pay gap. It would be better, I think, if we could argue for higher wages for everyone, as Sally was saying this morning. Just for your interest, the highest or worst gaps are in the financial insurance sectors, professional, scientific and technical services, and rental, hiring and real estate. The best outcomes are in public administration, other services and retail trade. So the gap is closest in two industries that are characterised by slightly different wage setting mechanisms. One where it's more centralised, and that's the public sector, and two in retail where it's dominated by women, so that the industry gap is smaller because there are more women in that industry. So we've got a pay gap occurring, and that partly explains... it's partly explained by the hours of work women do, but not totally. And most research will show that the major reason for a pay gap is outright discrimination, and second reasons are segregation and the jobs that women, the valuing of jobs that women do. So we've got these shifts in the labour market. We've got this huge issue about a pay gap that is persistent. And the other thing we've got in Australia, which is affecting women, is that we're an ageing society. So more and more women in Australia are living longer. That's another area where men could do better. And I hope that they do better rather than women do worse. So we do have a gap in age. Women live longer than men, and you can see by 2025 there's going to be many more women than men. And also that dependency ratio for the economy is quite stark, that the number of people who depend on younger people for services and financial help through our tax system is going to increase. So we have a real need to think about our super industry because, of course, that's the issue. That's how we're supposed to fund our retirement. And there we have a really complex problem because the combination of women's working lives and their experience in the workforce, coupled with the pay gap, has led to a huge superannuation gap. And I can't see that closing very quickly at all. Of the Australian population over 65, 14.5% are more. There are 14.5% more women than men, and by the time we get to 85 and above, there are 3 times as many women than men. Those women, given their work histories, are much more likely to be dependent on assistance from outside the household finances, and more dependent on finances from the state. So what is that system? Well, it's a combination of our aged pension system and our superannuation system. Many of those older women will not have access to any superannuation. That may change, and I'd be interested to hear from if we could get good data on younger men and women in the workforce and how that will, sort of the cohort effect might change ageing and retirement later. But we do know, and this has already been referred to, there is a massive inequality in our superannuation system. Now, there's different sets of data, and I know one set was quoted before. So here I'm drawing on data from a colleague, Siobhan Austin at Curtin University, the Women in Super pay report, and the Senate report on the super system. So you can see that there's, for the male median super balance is in favour of men by 28%. But if we go into the age group who are 45 to 50, that gap is even wider. And so women who are of that older age have much less funding through their superannuation than younger, but furthermore, than men. But furthermore, what's really interesting to see and worrying is that the flow of money into super funds is highly gendered. So here we can see that employers' money going into super funds of men and women clearly favours men at the moment. And that goes back to our gender gap problem, pay gap problem, and our working hours problem. It also goes back to motherhood, and as with pay, if you're a woman with children, your pay is the lowest. If you're a woman with children, your superannuation is the lowest. If you're a man with children, your pay is the highest. If you're a man with children, your superannuation is the highest. So we have a really complicated set of problems here that we would want to address if we were to close that superannuation gap. We have a gender pay gap, which is informed by discrimination and segregation. We've got a motherhood working hours gap, which is a result of our gender order, inflexibility, I haven't even touched on that, and our broken childcare system. We have a motherhood pay gap because of the working hours that mothers work and the value of work that many women do once they have children, often shift where they work and the rewards they're getting. And because of our system of supplementary contributions, women do not have the funds to put into the supplementary contributions, so that gap is also widening. They don't have the capacity to contribute because their combined pay and income doesn't give them any excess in order to put into their superannuation. So trying to come to the end here, where do I think we should go to from here? Well, as I said, I think we need to raise the bar on all areas. We should be aiming for quality plus equality. We need a much better work regime, and that goes to the comments that Sally was making this morning. We do need to change the rules. We need a much better care regime, because it's only if we improve our childcare and our elder care. Remember, I said the other big group who have entered the labour market are women who are older, who also have elder care responsibilities. Unless we change that care regime, the government's goal to increase labour force participation cannot be reached. We do need to increase our pay, not just for women, but for women and men, but we also need to close the gap between men's and women's pay, so we need pay equality. But I also think we need to reinvent the superannuation structure that we have in Australia. It was and is held up to be one of Australia's great inventions, terrific in the 80s for a largely male workforce and modelled on a male's full-time working life, but doesn't fit the working life of women in Australia today. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marian. A lot to think about there, and right, so I'm sure there'll be loads of questions. Questions? Everyone's too stunned. Here we are, yes, the young woman over there, Mary.
I was just curious about reinventing the superannuation structure and your thoughts on where that should sit, whether it's as an employer, from a government perspective, or a combination of both.
Yeah, well, definitely from a combination of both. I mean, there's some clear changes we should make very soon. The obvious one, and it has been argued for some time, is to add superannuation to the paid parental leave, so that at least for that period of time, women aren't breaking their superannuation contributions. Because of the nature of superannuation, of course, the cumulative effect, if you lose out for a period of time, it does have an effect on your overall retirement. The low income threshold should be changed as well, the $450 a month, of course, to both enable women and casual workers to get a contribution. Plus, of course, there's a lot of attention to various aspects, but increasing the superannuation levy, the government, the employer levy. I mean, most people seem in agreement with that, but getting it done. There are lots of actual recommendations. I have to admit, it's not I'm not an expert in superannuation, but reading the various reports from the Henry Committee there are lots of great recommendations in those reports about what could be done to start to improve the system. But the problem is it's much deeper than just the structure of the superannuation system. It's also about the structure of pay. So in other countries, what they're doing now is putting money into female super schemes when they're on any caring break from the workforce. So Chile's they put an amount of public money into each woman's superannuation scheme in order to just keep the baseline higher through the rest of their working life as well. So I think that there are probably lots of plenty of structural issues we should look at, but there's some key ones we could do straight away, which would start to close the gap. It wouldn't really solve the whole problem, though.
Yes, another woman here, Mary. No, we need you to the microphone.
No, thank you. Just with the divorce rate,
yes.
There was no kind of commentary there about the impact of divorce and super splitting and so on.
Absolutely, yes, sorry. I mean, there are so many bits that I didn't get to cover, but you're right. There's some very... the current scheme, and this is my colleague Siobhan Austin's sort of area, but she's written about this, the structure of the current scheme assumes that what will happen is that men will stay married to women, and that when they reach retirement, they will share equally their superannuation with women. And the reality is that that's not happening, both through broken marriages, but all sorts of other issues. So that's another issue that I think we need to address.
Right, yes, Tim.
you. It's a well-known fact that GDP and environmental degradation are positively correlated. In the United States in the last 30-odd years, GDP's risen quite significantly, but the genuine progress indicator, the GPI, has actually fallen, very much because of environmental issues, but also issues relating to congestion and smaller housing lots, all those sorts of things. So I was surprised that your emphasis on raising GDP through increased participation rates, and you were apologetic that men had a declining participation rate in the last 40 years.
Yeah, don't misinterpret what I was saying. I am sceptical of that argument too. That's what I was saying, that all the governments around the world and international bodies are advocating it, but I don't think it is the right way to go unless we examine the quality of life that we're also experiencing.
All right. So just in conclusion, I'd say I think the best thing to bring about equality would be to lower men's participation rates and lower the growth in GDP over time, rather than try and bring women up to men. That's where the quality would happen.
Yes.
I know the men wouldn't do any work at home, but that's...
Well, actually...
They can be trained.
No, that's true. So, look, I think... In principle, I sort of agree with what you're saying. The problem is that the decrease in men's participation rates isn't usually through choice of the men, it's through structural shifts in the economy. If it was a positive move that they were saying, I want to work fewer hours in order to look after children or contribute to society, that would be a nice outcome. But that's not the way it's working. We could look at the Dutch model, where there is a sort of an argument that they have almost the better system now, better than Sweden, and men and women in professional relationships tend to work 4 days a week each rather than 5. Yes, so as with all these things, trying to sort of argue all the detail is hard in 20 minutes, but I'm not disagreeing with you. If we could decrease men's, probably not participation, but hours of work. And I think that's where we should be looking. It's the distribution of hours of work, both within gender and across or between genders, because that's a real problem.
Right, yes. Linda here.
I think you can probably hear.
No, we need you for the recording.
You're on faster, Mary. Okay. Hi, thanks very much, Marian, and I realised that there was a lot you couldn't say.
That's right.
2 questions, I guess, about superannuation.
Yeah.
One is, we understand there's a very large amount of unpaid employer contributions to superannuation, and they are particularly focused amongst casual and the casual workforce,
yes,
which presumably ways of ensuring that was paid would certainly help women. And the second one, and it's probably a little bit more complicated than you can handle right now, but the huge growth in superannuation has been in self-managed superannuation funds, and I'm wondering what research there has been on women versus men's control over self-managed superannuation funds.
I can only partially answer both questions, but the first one, the super theft, is a real problem, and it's not just for women. I think a lot of youth are caught in that as well, and that's part of the structure of opting for the schemes that you're contributing to, and I think it would be better if we could roll them all into one and make it as it used to be. It just goes. You don't get much choice about where it goes, and it goes into that. And we do need to work out a way of reclaiming that money. The second one, the issue of what was it? Self-managed. We've done a little bit of research that goes to that question. You may have sort of realised that sort of an accompanying argument to all this argument about there should be more women in the workforce is the argument that women are opting out of the workforce, and there's the growth in what are called mumpreneurs, female entrepreneurs, and they're opting out because the workplaces they used to work in are so inflexible and difficult for them to mix their care and work. So we've done a study of those women, and what we found with those women who are setting up their own businesses, there are two things they're not doing. They're hardly paying themselves a wage at all, and none of them are paying any superannuation into their own funds. They're not even aware of it a lot of the time. So I think that really is a major concern. But I haven't seen, and maybe the super people here have got more data on the split in self-managed funds between male and female. It would be really worth knowing that, and I'll follow that up. Thank you.
And last but not least, our American visitor.
How do you do?
Hi, Marian.
Hi.
I was really curious about the quality aspect of your equation.
Yeah.
And just how to evaluate, or if there were metrics in place for evaluating the quality of work. If, say, a mother is only able to work 6 hours as compared to everyone else's 9 or 10, how she could approach her employer, or if there were already, like I said, metrics in place to kind of determine what her quality of work is.
There are lots of metrics around workplaces and what their policies are like, and how, whether or not they're working for women or for any parents or people with other responsibilities. I'm just trying to think. I'm not aware of one. It's sort of an interesting idea of one that would say, how do we measure an individual woman's work experience compared to another person's? I mean, hours of work, we do know if you reduce your hours of work, it immediately leads to a wage drop. But it doesn't necessarily lead, or it hasn't to date, and I think this will change too, to an hourly wage drop, because in Australia we have had, until now, quite a good system, which I think we probably haven't realised how important it is, that part-time workers, I'm not talking about casual, part-time workers, get pro rata the conditions, pay and conditions of full-time workers in most cases. In countries like Canada and America, Jim, you might correct me on Canada, they don't. They get lower. Like, being part-time actually gives you lower hourly wages as well as other access to other conditions of work. So it's a really important aspect of our system that we have to hold on to. Of course, it's being eroded because casualisation is the way to get around that. Our casual loadings protect our hourly rates a bit until we knock them off as well. But of course, casuals don't have access to the paid leaves, etc., of a permanent part-time or full-time worker. So you could develop a sort of a metric, casual, part-time, full-time, and we could think about how that could best be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Marian, it's been fantastic. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
We all look forward to your coming. And I want to say a special thank you to Marian for coming, because
That's right.
she was away overseas earlier in the week. So it's with great
pleasure.
joy you've come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure, Marian. Thank you.